When I first started working on this talk, my intention was to, sorry, I'm kind of blanking here a second. Oh yes, my intention was to use it as an opportunity to sort of air my grievances with the music industry, the mainstream music industry that is. Taking specific issue with the fact that many of today's most famous rock stars have appeared in commercials to promote the products of our country's largest corporations. Now, I was prepared to take issue with Taylor Swift, who, by virtue of appearing in a commercial for Diet Coke, seemed to have sold her rock and roll soul to the devil of success. To counter that, I was going to extol the virtues of being an independent artist like myself, who was struggling so honorably to make art instead of selling out. To illustrate this point, I was going to talk about my own experiences as a musician in the band River Wireless, a folk rock quartet from right here in Asheville. My final point being that real rock stars were not beholden to corporate executives or stockholders, that real rock stars were people, not images on a screen or in the pages of a glossy magazine. And that the more people I can make aware of this, the better it would be for everybody. Well, when I presented these ideas to my bandmates for feedback, they said pretty much the same thing they would say to me if I came up with a drum part they didn't really like. It needs work. Hallie, our violinist, pointed out that while Taylor Swift has in fact appeared in several commercials for Diet Coke, she was also named the most charitable celebrity 2 years in a row by the nonprofit organization DoSomething.org. Daniel, our bass player, reminded me of something I already knew but neglected to acknowledge, which was that while many of the world's largest record labels do have a tendency to churn out assembly line style hits, is what I call them, the enormous profits those hits generate are what help to fund their smaller subsidiary labels, many of which we not only respect as a band, but would like someday to do business with. And finally, Ryan, our guitar player, asked what you might call the million-dollar question, which was this: what would we do if Coca-Cola approached River Wireless with an offer to do a commercial? Well, I can't exactly answer that question, but I will say that I realized once again things are not as simple as I would like them to be. And that my grievances were not so much with the glamorous people I saw on screen as with the way in which I sometimes let their images distort my own definition of success. So that's what this talk is actually about. It's about my own thoughts and experiences regarding success, which I will not extol for the sake of convincing you of my authority on the subject, but of your own. So here goes. River Wireless, the folk rock quartet from Asheville, first formed in 2006. As students at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, we'd only been together for about a year, when in 2007, we signed a 5-year, one-album contract with the university's own Split Rail Records. Now, funded by the university and largely student-run, Split Rail was a pretty small operation. Compared with what it costs to put out just one hit single nowadays, which, according to a study conducted by NPR in 2011, is about $1,078,000. Our budget, which was about $10,000 for the making of a whole record, seemed comparatively modest. There would be no team of songwriters, no highly paid vocal coaches or producers, no million-dollar marketing campaign. Nevertheless, we'd be assigned a producer, a team of student engineers, and we'd be given use of a multi-million-dollar studio in which to record. So we were pretty excited. I remember the first day I walked into the studio, I felt like Ringo Starr entering Abbey Road, thinking to myself, it was just another day in the life of a group of soon-to-be rock stars. But what we discovered was, even in our low-pressure, relatively low-pressure, low-budget environment, there were still certain expectations we were supposed to meet. since the label was paying for studio time, we didn't have the sort of Beatles-esque experimentation or the time for that kind of experimentation that we had hoped for. We had strict deadlines. If those deadlines weren't met, the cost of any additional studio time would come out of our pockets. Our producer, who aspired to work in Nashville, approached our tracking session as if we were all these seasoned studio musicians that we most certainly were not. So it didn't exactly go very smoothly. And then later, this producer suggested that we use auto-tune on the vocals. And we took his word for it. He later insisted that we simplify certain lyrics, omit possibly offensive phrases. Again, we said, you know best. There are certain standards he tried to explain to us that the label feels must be met in order for the album to sell as many copies as possible. Well, as it turned out, the album did sell relatively well. The cost of its production was recouped within the first year, and we were thereafter free to start collecting royalties, however modest they may have been. But in 2009, we were contacted by a producer who actually had worked in Nashville. This producer, whose resume included names like John Mayer and AC/DC, had heard our first record and was expressing interest in working with us on our second. He told us that under his direction, and with his connections within the industry, we were certain to sell at least 10,000 copies of our next release. The catch was, however, at least as we saw it, we had to give him absolute authority as a producer. So we listened to some of the work he'd been doing recently, and though it wasn't bad per se, it seemed to embody a lot of the things that we'd come to dislike about our first release. Now, we still wanted to sell 10,000 copies of our record, don't get me wrong. We also needed to like the music we were making before selling 10,000 copies would be truly satisfying. Now, were we young and idealistic and incredibly naive about that? I would say yes. But we were also attempting to be honest. Attempting to be honest and accepting our fate as something other than chart-topping rock stars. And since no other record labels or producers were expressing interest in our attempted honesty, we decided we'd attempt it alone. Now, nobody in the band at this time had any experience as a recording engineer. We didn't own any of the equipment we needed, no microphones, no software, none of the stuff we needed to make a record. Nor did we have any idea really how to use any of that stuff. We all worked day jobs, which earned us enough to get by to cover our basic living expenses, but we didn't have any money to buy any of that equipment I just mentioned. So to raise money, we turned to the internet. Using the website Kickstarter as a platform, we started a fundraising campaign. The campaign was successful. We raised over $5,000, which for the making of a record isn't all that much, but it's a pretty good start. So with that money, we bought a used mixing board, some microphones, and made some upgrades to the laptop we were going to use to track the record. For a studio, we used the master bedroom of the house we were renting in South Asheville. And when the record was finally finished a year later, instead of pouring the $1 million we didn't have into a marketing campaign, we hit the road. Now, to illustrate what life is like for us on the road, I'll just tell a story. The story begins in Montreal, where our van broke down about 30 miles outside of the city. A hose had exploded, and radiator fluid was spewing everywhere. Well, we'd all turned off our cell phones to avoid racking up international charges, but we had to suck it up and call a tow truck. Well, the man on the other end of the line spoke French. We tried to tell him where we were, but all the road signs were also in French. In the meantime, a passing motorist had stopped to see if we needed any help. Now, I admit now that he seemed a little crazy, but he spoke English, and he was offering to drive us to an auto parts store where we might find a replacement hose. So, Ryan and I left Hallie and Dan with the van and climbed into the backseat of the stranger's SUV. As soon as we shut the door, he floored it. And we watched from the backseat as the speedometer reached and then surpassed 100 miles per hour. So we put on our seatbelts and closed our eyes. Then I smelled marijuana. When I opened my eyes again, he was offering us a joint. When we refused, he shrugged and smoked the whole thing by himself. So we drove from one small French village to another looking for an auto parts store, watching from the back seat as this guy was throwing lighted fireworks out the window at people in the street. When we finally found the auto parts store, they didn't have the part we were looking for, so we just bought some generic hosing, some fasteners, and a roll of duct tape. This journey took about 2 hours, and when we finally got back to the place where the van had broken down, Dan and Hallie in the van were all gone. We didn't know where the tow truck had taken them, but we did know that our gig started in about an hour. So we asked our chauffeur if he minded driving us to Montreal to the venue. He shrugged, threw his last firework out the window, veered across 2 lanes of traffic, romped through the grassy median, and came squilling out into traffic heading northbound toward Montreal. The venue, when we finally arrived, was packed. The opening band had just finished playing, so Ryan and I literally pushed through the crowd and met Dan and Hallie on stage and immediately started playing. After the show, the venue fed us and paid us pretty well and put us up for the night in an old nunnery. 2 days later, we were in Toronto. We didn't know anybody in Toronto, and the show we were supposed to play that night had been canceled. I can't remember why. So we spent the whole night sitting in the van drinking some warm beer we found rolling around in the back and just watching people on the street. We'd spent all the money we made in Montreal to have the van repaired, which meant we didn't have even enough money to pay for a campsite for the night, which is about $20. So after the beer was gone, we just drove to a residential section of the city, parked in front of somebody's house, and slept in the van. At 7 o'clock that morning, we were woken by a very disgruntled man where he stood in his driveway spraying our van with a garden hose. That night, we played in Rochester, New York for a packed house, followed by 2 nights in Ohio where we played for almost nobody. From Toledo, we drove through the night and arrived in Chicago at dawn, where we parked on the street again and slept for a couple hours until about 9 o'clock in the morning, at which point we started loading our equipment into the studio where we were scheduled to play a live performance for the blog Audio Tree Live. After that was finished, we packed up all our stuff and drove across the city and did the whole thing all over again, this time for a blog called Here Ya. That night, still in Chicago, without a show to play, we bought tickets to see the Cubs play the Red Sox at Wrigley Field. So that's just one story I can tell about how exciting the road is, how unpredictable it is. There's also the story about the snowstorm in Arizona, or getting lost in the California desert, or hiking Seattle's Mount Si, or going sailing in Savannah. But after 2 years of almost constant touring, the venues we were playing were still mostly loud bars and deserted coffee shops, and no record label had yet to express any interest in picking us up. So the album had done okay when it first came out. It received praise from several small publications, and in the first week of its release, it was a top seller on the website Bandcamp. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but we had put it up there on the website as a name-your-own-price digital download, and it was a top seller. But even with those positive things, I don't think we expected to return home after 2 years on the road, to have to resume working our day jobs, worrying about money as we had before, and really having no idea how we were going to finance the making of the third record, which seemed like the most logical thing for us to do at that point. So we definitely were not rock stars. But looking back on it, I would say that our efforts were not entirely fruitless. After foregoing the opportunity to sell 10,000 records with our producer friend in Nashville, we managed, after 2 years on the road, to sell 5,000 copies on our own. In October 2012, after we returned from all that touring, we were contacted by a booking agency out of Knoxville, Tennessee, who expressed interest in adding River Wireless to their roster. And now, for the first time since the band's formation, we've actually started making a little bit of money. Now, it's not a whole lot of money. We're still working day jobs. We still have no idea how we're going to finance the making of the third record. But it's enough to pay a manager who's helping us figure that out. And as far as creatively speaking goes, we've never felt more confident or excited about what we're doing. So as I said, looking back, all in all, I think we're doing okay. And even though Coca-Cola has yet to approach us about doing an advertisement, we're pretty proud of our accomplishments. So, that said, the only real advice I feel comfortable giving is don't take my advice. Or anyone else's for that matter. At least not ahead of your own. That's how we approach songwriting. We start with something that's satisfying to us. A line, a rhythm, or melody. Something that seems to scratch that inner itch. Whenever anybody asks me what my goals are as a musician or what we're trying to accomplish as a band, I always try to explain that itch. Of course we want to be successful, I say. We want recognition and respect, and we want to make money. But I think we've all come to realize the black hole that hunger for success could become if not reinvested into scratching that mysterious itch. So to conclude, I'll tell you something that most of you probably already know, which is that we can't all become rock stars. But I believe that our strengths and talents are distributed far more evenly than our wealth. A truth that is made evident by the fact that if we all became the glamorous people we wanted to be, society would cease to function. And I offer that not as consolation for the hard, boring, tedious, or otherwise unpleasant work we all have to do in order to make a living, but to remind you, as I must remind myself, that success is born of our authority to define it. Thank you.